Thank you, Andrea. Thank you, Ian, for the very kind invitation. It's a real privilege to be here to talk to what seems like a really lively and active HA branch. So I'm really flattered to be invited to talk about my research. So what I want to do is talk about some of the new project I'm working on about, as Andrea said in the introduction, the fate of cultural sites, objects that are destroyed or looted and taken during the First World War, and what became of them after the war. So one of the terms I'll talk about a lot is the idea of reparations. I think many people may well be familiar with the idea of reparations after the First World War. They may have come across this previously as one of these major financial consequences of the First World War, that Germany was forced to pay huge amounts in reparations to victorious allies, and this was one of the causes of the rise of the Nazis, one of the causes of the Second World War, and so on. And I think traditionally the topic of reparations in this period is always seen as a financial and kind of political or economic question. I'm not really interested in that. I find it too complicated for me. It's been written about, researched to death as well. But what I am interested in is how this reparations process after the First World War actually involved a lot more than just questions of finance and transfers of money from one state to another. It was also about restitution of cultural property, reconstruction of cultural sites, and various topics that I'll get into in the course of the talk. My background then, so as Andrea very kindly said in her introduction, I've written about the First World War in lots of different contexts, and most recently I wrote a book about humanitarianism after the First World War, so how Europe was rebuilt in a humanitarian way, various forms of aid that were provided in the aftermath of the conflict to help in its reconstruction. And that sort of led me towards this very interesting question of reparations and restitution that I want to talk about. Because again, I discovered that like one of these interesting themes in the period is the fate of cultural sites that have been destroyed in fighting, or cultural sites that have been looted during the sort of fog of war between 1914 and 1918. So what's a new project we'll look at, and what I will talk about a bit. Well, first of all, I'll start by talking about cultural destruction during the First World War, to give some background on that and sort of the main things to know and kind of why this was significant at the time, what it tells us about the First World War. I will talk then a little bit about what happened after the war in the sense of why people felt it was important that cultural sites that had been destroyed or looted or pillaged in different ways ought to be part of the post-war peacemaking process in terms of including these kind of things in post-war treaties. And then I'll talk a little bit towards the end about how this played out in practice. So how reparation was intended to happen in the early 1920s as a result of post-First World War settlements. I should say as well, so this is a new project. I've been sort of chipping away at it for the last few years. I don't have really firm conclusions, but I will have sort of some examples of things I find interesting towards the end, and maybe then in questions, people might have maybe suggestions or observations about where the direction it's going in, but I can't claim to have completed all of the research for this project. So, cultural destruction during the First World War. This was one of the big themes in 1914 when the First World War broke out. The contemporaries almost immediately felt made this war different. And this is because they were acutely aware that the First World War was a sort of historic event. In August 1914, within weeks, people were writing histories of the First World War. They felt it was something, like I said, historic and different to conflicts that had come before. And one of the things that they sort of identified in the conflict that made it that way was cultural destruction. Now, by that, I mean destruction or damage to what we might call cultural sites, churches, cathedrals, museums, universities, schools, that category of buildings. There are two events right at the start of the First World War which became hugely famous or infamous like I said, within weeks of the outbreak of the conflict, and which people may have come across before. The first one took place in the 25th, 26th of August 1914 in Belgium. So as the German army was invading, going through Belgium on its way to France, which is part of its war plan, they encountered various pockets of resistance from Belgian civilians. There's a number of atrocities took place where civilians were executed in different towns. The most infamous of those took place at Leuven, where the university library was burnt down in the course of these events. Now, this immediately became, like I said, infamous. News of this went around the world very, very quickly, because this university library, you can see the before and after images on the slide on the screen, and the university library building dated to the 18th century. It contained manuscripts going back to the early modern period, which weren't replaceable. This was seen as waging war on culture, basically setting fire to, burning down a site that had absolutely no military significance whatsoever, and it's purely cultural. It immediately outrages the Allies, so we're talking about Britain and France primarily, but also, and what happens at Leuven goes around the world. It becomes a really important propaganda or point in propaganda to convince neutral countries to join the war on the side of the Allies. And the arguments that is made at the time is that Germany is waging a war against culture. Germany is in some ways, quote unquote, uncivilized because they're targeting cultural sites, and that the Allies stand on the side of civilization and culture and so on. So this is very important for propaganda. Within a few weeks, the start of September 1914, in northern France, the cathedral at Reims then is shelled again by the German army. And this also kind of becomes an infamous point that makes its way around the world, is using propaganda. The shelling of cathedral has the added sort of impetus. This is like a holy site. It's very important to Catholics. So you're trying to convince people of the stakes in the war, and you're trying to convince people that the enemy are barbaric, that the Allies are the good guys who stand for Christian, civilized Western values. This is very important as well. So cultural destruction, like I said, within a month of the outbreak of the First World War, becomes very, very important to how the war is portrayed and how it's used in propaganda, and the stakes that people understand the war to be about, how they perceive the enemy, how they perceive the Allies, and what they believe they're fighting for. Very, very important to propaganda. And I think even by, if we fast forward a couple of years towards the end of the First World War by 1918, these two events still remain very, very prominent in the public imagination of how people think about the First World War, even though cultural destruction is really widespread during the First World War on all manner of different fronts. If we look in northern France and Belgium, there are many churches that are badly damaged, destroyed, schools, universities, cathedrals. If we look on the Eastern Front, this is also very widespread, but we know very, very little about it even still. The capacity for destruction to be wrought on cultural sites also is sort of exacerbated as the war goes on by technological advances. The rise of aerial bombardments by the end of the war means that we have things like Venice being bombed in 1918 by the Austro-Hungarian army. Paris is being bombarded in the spring of 1918 by the Germans, by their long-range field guns. So there's lots of different versions and iterations of cultural destruction taking place. It's very much something that is very prominent in the First World War, but it's these early iterations of it that kind of remain really prominent in the imagination and in propaganda. I've got some other sort of images, images of things like museums being disturbed by bombings. This is a museum in Lille in northern France, and this is damage in the University of Belgrade. All kind of is presented as evidence in propaganda that of the stakes at play and who like I said, what each side is fighting for, what each side represents. I should say, sort of as a sort of a caveat before I move on, because this is so prominent in propaganda, I think both sides, so both the Central Powers, so Germany and Austria-Hungary, but also then the Allies. They realized that damaging cultural sites in wartime is something to be avoided, if for no other reason than it's bad in propaganda. There'll be a backlash. So Germany tries very hard in Belgium to kind of, in the areas they occupy, to take stock of museums, collections, and churches, those sites, and to protect them where they can. And primarily because they realized it was such a negative backlash in 1914 that it was best avoiding that in the future where they could. So people very quickly become aware of the sort of negative implications of this kind of thing. So lots of cultural damage during the First World War. I want to talk then about what happens at the war's end. So the armistice is signed November 1918. The various countries, the victorious allies especially, then begin thinking about making peace and thinking of what the terms of the peace ought to be. So they assemble in Paris in January 1919. A very famous picture on the slide, which people may be familiar with, showing the kind of the big players, the big four at the Paris Peace Conference, and Lloyd George on the left, Orlando from Italy, Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister, and Woodrow Wilson, the American president on the right. And the Paris Peace Conference becomes a forum for discussions about what to do with the aftermath of cultural destruction and instances where there was evidence of looting and so on. This becomes a big theme that's discussed by the peacemakers, as they were called, as they styled themselves at the Paris Peace Conference. And this is all bundled up in this issue of reparations. So I mentioned at the beginning, reparations, traditionally when people think about reparations in this period, if you've studied the First World War in any way, it's sort of always seen as a financial issue. So making the defeated enemy pay for the damage wrought during the conflict. So reparations emerges as a major issue during the Paris Peace Conference in the discussions. And people, and I'll come back to this point in a later slide, but people talk about reparations specifically rather than in previous wars, they talked about paying indemnities. In the First World War, they use this term reparations, which I'll explain a bit further in a couple of slides' time. However, if we look, and if anyone's ever been unable to sleep and has read the treaties that are signed at the end of the First World War to kind of help you off sleep, and you will find that every single one of the post-war treaties has a provision or a number of provisions that relate to the return of cultural objects, the restoration of certain cultural sites, or different provisions that specifically hinge on cultural sites. So this is an outcome of these discussions in Paris in 1919, which I'll talk a bit more about how that came about. Key thing to say, and again, if anyone has sort of studied the First World War before, they will know that the agreements at the end of the First World War, incredibly complex, hugely complex set of issues had to be determined because we'd had various empires had collapsed, new states had emerged, and there was a big issue of drawing boundaries for new states. And there was a question of how to treat the defeated powers, all sorts of very, very complicated issues. Reparations emerged as one of those issues. Again, highly, highly complex, as I'll show in a few slides' time. And I think we'll sort of see that the complexity of these things leads to some of the outcomes that emerge in the aftermath. So again, this is the Insomniacs reading list, if you are interested in that, and the 5 post-war treaties at the end of the First World War. Like I said, all of them make some reference to the consequences of cultural destruction in wartime. And I think people sometimes forget that there were 5 treaties at the end of the First World War, because I think for very good reason, we sort of focus on the Treaty of Versailles, the big one, which was signed with Germany. But each one of the defeated states in the First World War had their own treaty at the end of the war. So that meant Germany was one of the defeated states, but likewise Austria, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Turkey all had different treaties as defeated states. And each of those makes some reference to culture or cultural destruction in different ways. Also worth mentioning that none of these states were represented at the Paris Peace Conference. So none of them actually were involved in a negotiation on these terms, but rather the Allies determined what the content of these treaties would be. Then they presented it to the defeated powers and said, you will need to sign that because you've been defeated. That's just kind of how these things worked. But what I will do in this talk, I will focus primarily on the Treaty of Versailles because that has maybe more interesting things to say on this. And also because it was the first, it set the precedent for the ones that followed. So Treaty of Versailles is signed on the 28th of June, 1919. And a huge amount of discussion and debate goes into the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. And they then feed into what's agreed with Austria and Bulgaria and Hungary and Turkey as well. So Treaty of Versailles is important in that way. What became very apparent to the peacemakers in January 1919 as they were assembling in Paris was that they were going to be petitioned by all manner of lobbyists and people with particular agendas or issues they wanted to advocate for. Now, in many cases, that was people writing to Woodrow Wilson, the American president, or to David Lloyd George, British Prime Minister, say on behalf of their nation, saying, we want the right to exist as a nation. We want you to rubber stamp our statehood at the Paris Peace Conference. And you've got nationalists from different parts of the world, from Ukraine, from French Indochina, Egypt, Ireland, trying to get to Paris to make the claim for their statehood. You also have lots of people writing to the peacemakers to make the case that they should have certain cultural items returned to their nation. And the volume of these letters coming in, so Woodrow Wilson, the American president, commented on the number of letters that he was receiving on this topic from lots of different groups. And he wrote in June 1919 that he was worried about the danger of arbitrary decisions being made with respect to the appropriation of works of art and relics in Vienna, in Constantinople, and elsewhere. And he also commented on just the number of different claims for lots of different things, for artworks, for relics that were coming to him that, in a sense, the peacemakers are being asked to make decisions about. And again, this is way beyond what they had maybe expected the process to entail. So when the Paris Peace Conference starts in January 1919, it sets up a commission on reparations, and this is going to be the place where lots of these decisions are made. Now, the problem with this is that the commission on reparations is primarily staffed by people who think of reparations purely as a financial or a legal issue. So all the people on this commission, the Commission for the Reparation of Damages, as it was called, are people fraught with a financial or a legal background, because that's what people thought the issue was. So the chair is this brilliantly mustachioed man, the French finance minister, Klotz. He was the chair. Britain had two representatives on this commission, Lord Sumner and Lord Milner. Lord Sumner was a very prominent judge. Milner was a former governor of the Bank of England. People who come from a particular background, not experts in art or in cultural matters as such. But because this commission is dealing with reparations, they're the people who are going to end up making decisions about this kind of stuff. For them, well, they didn't want to get into the detail of making specific decisions about restoring a particular artwork from one country to another, because they didn't have the background to make those determinations. So their position is that this commission wants to kick the can down the road a little bit, not commit to any specific restitutions. They will try and agree on broad principles, such as setting up a commission after the First World War to have them determine on various cases. But they're getting lobbied by loads of different countries, and also institutions. So museums are lobbying the museum experts. Different new states are lobbying the Reparations Commission, looking for the return of certain objects which they feel are important to their sort of national identity. the Commission for the Reparation of Damages, one of the things it does, like I said, they rule out the principle of restitution in kind. So some states say, well, we've suffered so badly in the war. If if this former enemy state just gives us these various artworks, that will make up for those things. But then they sort of rule this out. They don't want to go down that road. But the major point is that the people making these decisions are not experts in art or in cultural matters. They are all financial experts and legal experts. There is one important point that I wanted to make about all this. I mentioned earlier that people in the First World War start talking about the idea of reparations rather than indemnities. I think in the 19th century, wars traditionally ended with a treaty, and typically the victor state would say, we want the defeated state to pay us an indemnity. Now that's a figure. Basically, it's a kind of a monetary figure that could be essentially plucked out of the air as the cost of doing business. The cost of being defeated essentially is an indemnity. Reparations are slightly different in the sense that reparations sort of, and this term, I want to do more research on this, but this term becomes quite widespread during the First World War and for what people expect to happen afterwards. Reparation suggests that there's a kind of a repair of harm being done. It suggests that this is a sort of more literal repayment or addressing of damage that's been caused in the course of the war. Our Lord Sumner, one of the British representatives, I have the quote on screen, he says during one of these discussions that reparation should be the right to demand a reparation for acts done in violation of international law, what that means is that not only is this a question of the victor state telling the defeated state, you must pay us this amount. It means that if they have also done damage to a neutral state, such as Belgium in 1914, they can also be compensated for the damage done. At its extreme, I think one of the French are very big proponents of reparations rather than indemnities. One of the reasons that this was such a complex issue in 1919, people who have ever read about the reparations in the First World War, famously the Paris Peace Conference couldn't agree on a figure, because the French basically said they wanted to be compensated for every single item that had been damaged, literally, during the First World War in the north of France and the occupied departments, which literally means every broken window, every pencil in schools, every book. They asked the mayors to go out, do surveys very, very quickly of all the damage that had been done, and literally count this all up, make a bill. It's a very literal form of reparation. But this also does tell us something about the idea that reparation means you are addressing a harm, you're addressing a literal damage done, and making a very literal payment for that. And that was the French position in this period. One of the other reasons then that we have all of these claims and issues about cultural property in 1919 is because of the political consequences, first of all. So again, people may be familiar with versions of this map from different contexts, basically showing how Europe changed as a result of the First World War, how we had a number of empires, multi-ethnic empires that existed in 1914, which collapsed under the pressure of war by the end, and which meant that we have new states rising up, new nation states in Central and Eastern Europe emerge at the end of the war. Why is that significant to this issue of culture, its claiming and restitution? Well, because in places like, I would say, for example, in Vienna, which is now the capital of Austria, and Vienna had been the capital of the Habsburg Empire. So back in 1914, it was the capital of a much bigger multi-ethnic empire. The museums in Vienna had gathered together, sort of, if you like, the best of cultural objects, artwork from around the empire. And in 1919, these new nation states said, actually, we want to claim this stuff back. We are now nations. This originates from our nation, and we want to be able to have these kind of objects on display in our new nation states. And this is a sort of a common call in lots of the new nation states. Places like Poland make big claims. because they've just been granted independence at the end of the First World War. They want cultural material returned to them, which they claim originated there. Italy makes lots of claims for material in museums in Vienna as well. And going back to the wars of the 19th century, the Italians go as far as in February 1919, as the Paris Peace Conference is sitting, as people are discussing these things, they're in museums in Vienna, taking paintings off the walls and claiming them as being of Italian origin. So this is literally a photograph of this process taking place. And again, then the peacemakers in Paris are trying to make sense of this and work out the provenance of these items. How do you determine what has originated in Italy? What principles can be applied to these things? They didn't know what was actually happening in Vienna. It's all very, very complicated. There are lots of different claims flying about for cultural items for different reasons. So what I want to do is I want to talk then about what actually happens then, some of the outcomes. I want to give a few examples from the Treaty of Versailles about objects that actually end up in that treaty. So again, if you're reading this as an insomniac and you get to Article 245, you might wake up and then say, oh, that's actually interesting. And the reason, there are three specific articles in the Treaty of Versailles that talk about restoring certain objects to different states. I mentioned a few minutes ago the Reparation Commission didn't want to do that because they didn't understand the issues and they didn't want to make pronouncements about specific items. The reasons then we have various things in these treaties is because politicians went over their heads on certain issues where they were sort of seen to be not sort of in the interest of certain nations, and specifically where they're in the interest of the victorious powers. So France, Britain, and then also Belgium end up with certain claims in the Treaty of Versailles. So the first one I want to briefly mention is the Treaty of Versailles, Article 245. So you're going deep into the treaty to get to Article 245. But basically says the French want to claim back various trophies, archives, historical souvenirs, or works of art taken away from France by the German authorities during the Franco-Prussian War. And they said, we will send a list to Germany of these various items, but they special on the French flags taken during the Franco-Prussian War. And so this is basically a case of undoing, I guess, the bitter taste of France's defeat during the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, 1871. You will notice as well, given that reparations were meant to be about undoing the damage done during the First World War, 1870 to 1871 is not the First World War, but it's kind of it's an inconsistency in this. But France could demand this, because they were a victor state and they had power at this time. The image on the slide shows by 1920, these flags and items, trophies had been returned. The Germans had given them back. And there's a ceremony in Paris, at the Pantheon in Paris, so you can see these flags, which are the right of that image being held by soldiers. And this is on the same day as they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Republic. So it's kind of all part of a big kind of political sort of choreographed event, with the flags are central to that. So for them, it's about undoing the issues from the Franco-Prussian War. And Britain also includes an article in Treaty of Versailles about this. This is a slightly obscure claim. So there's two items in this. One is that, again, this is going sort of inserted from above. One is that they wanted Germany to restore to the king of the Hejaz a Quran of the Caliph Ottoman, which was apparently taken from Medina by the Turkish authorities and allegedly presented to the Emperor Wilhelm II. When people looked at this, turned out it hadn't been. So that couldn't be enacted. So that in the aftermath, there's no evidence to suggest that it actually taken place. And the second one was calling for the handover of the skull of a Sultan Maqawa, which had been removed from the Protectorate of Germany, East Africa, and taken to Germany. So he had led various revolts against German rule in Germany, East Africa in the late 19th century. again, this is very problematic. There was obviously human remains being treated very problematic for one reason. No one's quite sure where these remains were, and they weren't ultimately restored until the 1950s, I believe. So this was a very complicated issue, and again quite esoteric. But just again, I guess Britain sort of using its sort of victor's right to sort of undermine Germany's claims in various colonial settings. The final one then, and it takes us back to the beginning, is Leuven in Belgium was given its own article of the Treaty of Versailles, basically saying Germany needs to replace all of the manuscripts, all of the kind of quote unquote irreplaceable items, incunabula, printed books, maps, all these old items in their collections. Germany's responsible for replacing those things. But in addition to that, they also tacked on two bonus items which had nothing to do with the events of the First World War, which were two paintings. People, again, if anyone's ever visited Ghent, the Ghent altarpiece, very, very famous item by the Van Eyck brothers. The other one is a painting of the Last Supper by the Belgian painter Dirk Bouts, both of which were in German museums in this period, both of which were in German museums legally in this period as well. But this was, again, I guess the price for being defeated, that these terms could be dictated. And again, these were imposed as a sort of political decision into the treaty rather than being the result of the actual discussion of reparations by the Reparation Commission. So the Treaty of Versailles then, so it includes a number of named items. Like I said, each of them is included sort of as, a political decision. There's an even though Woodrow Wilson has talked about the danger of arbitrary decisions, there's a degree of arbitrariness. It's quite arbitrary in terms of the decision of what to include. In many cases, it doesn't relate at all to the experience of the First World War, but these are the inclusions. So what then of, like I said, all these disrupted or damaged churches, cathedrals, universities, looted items from museums? What about all the rest of it? For everybody else, there's one clause in the Treaty of Versailles, Article 238, which basically says that anything taken away, seized or sequestrated, can be returned if it can be identified. And if you can prove that something has been taken or destroyed during the cause of the war, or during the course of the war, you can then claim it back. So this is actually what Article 238 is, the one that is the big one for most cultural institutions in France and Belgium, and also lots of civilians, say chateau owners who had tapestries or paintings or whatever taken during the war. This is the mechanism by which they can claim back items that have been looted or which they claim have been looted. But they need to prove the provenance. So if they want to do this, they each have to prove that they own the item in the first place, that it was taken in the course of the war by the enemy. And that's often very, very difficult to do. So I'm drawing to the end, but I want to give 3 examples of different ways this could play out. Sort of bearing in mind this is still a work, from my perspective, still a work in progress, and talk through some of the challenges then for people of actually claiming back items through the Treaty of Versailles they thought had been taken during the war. So the first one I want to talk about briefly then is objects that have been quote unquote moved to safety, which is a term, a kind of euphemistic term that shows up in lots of paperwork that I've looked at. This is complicated because I mentioned earlier, cultural destruction was hugely invoked in propaganda. So both sides tried very hard to avoid either that negative propaganda hit after 1914, especially Germany is very alert to this. So what this meant in practice was in areas that were occupied by Germany or in areas near the front lines where, say, France or Britain's firing, let's say if we're talking about the Western Front, they're firing artillery towards the other side. if there are museums, churches, etc. in the vicinity, they would remove the stained glass, they would remove the collections from the museums and bring them somewhere safe. Now, it's very grey area, because in some cases, claims made after the war for certain items, they say the Germans might claim they were moved to safety, but it seems as they were maybe taken. In other cases, this is a very legitimate thing, and sometimes we can see cases where people are claiming, let's say French citizens are claiming items that have actually been moved to safety by the French authorities rather than the Germans. It's a very, very complicated area. And also in case, like I used sort of quote marks at the beginning, so much of this sort of work was improvised at the time. There was no plan in 1914 for how, as far as I can tell, for how to protect, let's say, churches or museum collections. They were doing it on the hoof, so they weren't storing these items in particularly appropriate facilities. So they were quite often damaged in the process of being moved, damaged in storage, and so on. So these are coins from the museum in Peronne, at the Somme department. If anyone's ever done the battlefields in the Somme region, Peronne was briefly the headquarters of the German army, and then it was liberated by the Australians, I think, in 1918. But this is one of the collections from the museum which was moved sort of to safety, and then had to be located after the war, and brought back to the Museum of Peronne. So this is one kind of example of a case we see claims going in at the end of the war for items which have been moved for different reasons, let's say. The second type which I've come across is personal property, and such as the place you can see in the image. And these quite a lot of these things emerged in the 1920s, where people will write to the International Reparations Commission, which was set up after the war to kind of oversee these huge payments that Germany's making to the Allies. But they also get people writing to them saying, I was in Leipzig last year and I was in an antique shop, and someone had a plate, and I'm pretty sure it's my plate. I'm pretty sure someone took it and I want to get it back. There's also quite a lot of that kind of evidence where people are coming across items which they allege were taken from their homes and from their chateaus, and turn up in Germany in the 1920s. And like I said, in antique shops, on the black market as well. So there's like I said, I've been through some of this documentation in the archives, but there's still a lot more to get through. This is also very difficult to evidence and to prove, because again, you need to prove ownership. What's a massive advantage is having access to a camera, which not everybody does, because sometimes people are relying on drawings to say it looks like this, which isn't great. If you're trying to convince the authorities to seize it from an antique shop somewhere in Germany. But there's quite a few of these kind of cases as well that emerge. This one, what was interesting with this one is that the crack was seen as distinctive, and thus that proved it has a very distinctive crack, and I want this plate back. The final one then is where you have, and I think this whole reparation process, certainly, like I've been looking at the French archives, not everybody's acting in good faith, basically. So you have a huge amount of displaced property. You've got very public announcements about, you quite often end up with big depots full of property that's been moved. Your furniture, pianos are very big, paintings, clocks, all sorts of things. And the local newspaper will announce you've got all these things, they've been moved, we're not sure where they're from, if it's yours, come and claim it. That presumes everybody's acting in good faith. So this tapestry was taken from the story was, it was seized by the French authorities in the Saarland. So the Saarland was being occupied in the early 1920s by the French, technically on German territory. It was seized from a German industrialist who had it in his possession, and they claimed that it had been looted during the war. He claimed that he bought it legally before the First World War, that he could evidence that there was a paper trail. The French authorities said no, and they said we put it through this process of sort of announcing its existence to to people who've reported lost tapestries and see who claims it. But the problem is 3 people claimed it was theirs. And that got very complicated. And how do you sort of prove this? As they organized viewings after a couple of years, that quickly one of the people out. He said 2 people claiming it was theirs at that point. And the industrialist, who later went on to be very sort of prominent Nazi in the 30s. So 3 people claiming it still. And this, I've tried to find a resolution for this. It seems to just sort of run out of steam by the late 1920s, in the sense that no decision was ever made and they couldn't evidence anyway who actually owned this tapestry. But I guess the point I want to make with that is that, again, it assumes everybody's acting in good faith. There are big black markets operating in this period as well, with people claiming things and selling things for their own personal profit, not necessarily because they lost it during the war. So, to conclude, and I'll draw your attention to this point, like I said, post-First World War reparations, I think, a really interesting area. And it's not just about the finance, although maybe people enjoy the finance, but there's a huge kind of documentation about people, objects, the loss of objects, especially cultural objects, and how those would be replaced and addressed after the war. I think one of the reasons this is such a big issue is, like I said, because of the cultural destruction in wartime, and how prominent that was in wartime propaganda. I mean, that's a really prominent issue at the end of the war as well, in terms of how the victorious Allies want to make peace. I think it's definitely true that the sort of decisions made about reparations tend to favour certain states based on their wartime experience. So that explains why we have these particular provisions in the Treaty of Versailles. Why Belgium is your benefits in a sense from having certain items restored to the because they weren't lost in the war. And geographical location. We don't see the kind of clauses that I mentioned in the Treaty of Versailles for France, Britain, and Belgium. You don't see those in the treaties with Bulgaria or Turkey in the east. There's a kind of a privileging of what happened on the Western Front as well. And also, the final point I want to make, which is maybe the bigger idea I'm trying to explore, is this idea of this sort of shift from talking about indemnities to reparations. So this fixation, or this new fixation on trying to literally make good for damage done during the war, in a very literal way of counting up and replacing every damaged item. So thank you so much for your attention. Thanks for the invitation again, and I look forward to some questions.